All right, everyone. So I want to talk about this idea that back in the medieval period or back in the Renaissance period, it was Christendom versus Islam. And the problem with this way of thinking is that it ignores and it does not address the fact that Europeans were fighting each other more than they were fighting against Muslims. There were more wars between Europeans than there were wars between European Christians and Muslims. And you have these people who talk about the past. They'll bring up the Middle Ages, they'll bring up the Renaissance period, and they'll say, oh, there were these battles between Christians and Muslims. But that's all they want to talk about. The reality is that there were way more wars between Europeans. There were so many wars that you could fill up an entire library with books on all of the wars that Europeans had against each other. And it's very, very disturbing to see right-wingers praising Vlad the Impaler. It's very disturbing to see this. They'll say, oh, Vlad the Impaler. And I remember years ago seeing this t-shirt in this right-wing website. And the t-shirt said something like, it's impaling time or something like that. It's very, very sick. And you have Romanians today who praise Vlad the Impaler. Oh, he was so based. He was so awesome because he killed Muslims. He killed Turks. He fought against the Ottoman Empire. But when you actually read about Vlad the Impaler, which I have done recently, I have been reading this book lately. It's called The Histories by a Greek historian who actually lived in that time. He actually lived at the time when Constantinople was taken over by the Ottoman Empire. His name is Laonikos Chalkokondyles. He wrote this book called The Histories, and the book gets into the ugly side of Christendom. It gets into the nitty-gritty reality of Christendom. And he talks about how the Christians and the Muslims fought each other, but he also talks a lot about how the Christians had all of these violent rivalries between each other. There was rivalry between the Greeks. There was rivalry between the Greeks and the Italians. There was even rivalry between the Serbs. And he even talks about how in one case, there was this city, this Serbian city, it was called Smederevo. And he talks about how the Serbian city of Smederevo actually went to the Ottoman Empire and said, rule over us. Now, people just can't fathom this because when we look at Serbia today, Serbs talk endlessly about how their ancestors fought against the Ottoman Empire. So this whole idea of Serbs in the past going to the Ottomans and asking to be ruled by the Turks, it's just completely contrary to this narrative that talks about Christendom versus Islamdom. But going back to Vlad the Impaler was, it goes without saying that Vlad the Impaler was a sick, evil, sadistic, cruel, brutal person. And he not only murdered Muslims, he also murdered other Christians. He murdered Bulgarians, he massacred Bulgarians, he murdered Germans, he massacred Hungarians, and he also massacred Muslims. So people say, oh, based Vlad the Impaler, he murdered Muslims. It's so awesome. For one thing, that's not awesome. He massacred people because they were Muslim. He massacred people because he considered them to be his enemies. And that would include just poor peasants. So what if they're Muslim? Just because someone is Muslim doesn't mean you have the right to massacre them. But this idea of praising Vlad the Impaler, it's actually quite cringe because Vlad the Impaler also butchered his fellow white man. People talk about how, white European Christians need to unite against the evil Muslims. Well, and they'll praise Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler literally massacred Bulgarians. He massacred Bulgarians. Now, Vlad the Impaler was supposed to be a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. He was supposed to be a vassal of the Sultan. And the reason for this was because his father was a vassal of the Sultan. And him and his younger brother, Radu the Handsome, they were actually both hostages for the Ottoman Empire. And the reason why they were hostages is because their father, Vlad II, gave them over as hostages to the Ottomans in order to show the Ottomans that he was a loyal vassal. So for years, Vlad the Impaler, his actual title is Vlad III Dracula, which literally means Vlad, the son of the dragon, because his father gave himself the title of Dracul, which means dragon, because his father was a part of some kind of an order called the Order of the Dragon, which envisioned the revival of the Crusader spirit. Anyway, so you had Vlad III Dracula, the Impaler, and his brother Radu the Handsome. They were both hostages of the Ottoman Empire, and while they were living in the Ottoman Empire, they were trained in the arts of war and sword fighting and philosophy, etc., etc. They were Ottomanized, and when Vlad the Impaler took control of Wallachia, which was just a region of what we today would call Romania, he butchered his political opponents. Not only did he butcher them, but he also murdered their wives and their children, and even their servants. Even the servants were not. Their servants couldn't escape his wrath. And the reason why he killed these people is because the men of these families were boyars. Boyars were nobles, and a lot of these boyars were Germans from Saxony. They were Transylvanian Saxons, I believe, and they were the ones who assassinated his father. Vlad the Impaler's dad was assassinated, and also they assassinated one of his brothers. So to enact revenge on the boyars, he not only impaled the boyars, he also massacred their wives, their children, and their servants. But you could say, well, they were asking for it because the men of those households murdered his father. But Vlad the Impaler also invaded Turkish territory, Ottoman territory on the Danube, and when he marched through this territory, he butchered tons of people, literally tens of thousands of people, not only Muslims, but also Bulgarians. We're talking about poor peasant people who had nothing to do with them. And he butchered these people, impaled them by the tens of thousands, decapitated them. Eventually, what happened was that Mehmet II declared war on Vlad the Impaler, and eventually he marched right into Wallachia, defeated Vlad the Impaler in a battle, and the Turks would behead a whole bunch of Romanian soldiers and then put their heads on the tips of their spears and then march with these spears back home. And eventually what happened was the Sultan, he went to the younger brother of Vlad the Impaler. His name was Radu the Handsome. And he said, Radu, I'm going to give you a nice big Turkish army. And this is what I've been reading in this book here. This is the histories here by Launikos Chakogondiles. He told Radu the Handsome, he said, I'm going to give you an army. You're going to join your army with this army, and then you're going to fight against your older brother. Radu the Handsome was a homosexual, by the way. He was a homosexual who, while he was a hostage in the Ottoman Empire with his brother Vlad the Impaler, he actually was sexually groomed by the Sultan Mehmet II. So Mehmet II sexually groomed, because Mehmet II was a huge pederast. He would literally, for example, after he defeated the Greek king, David of Trebizond, he took hundreds of young boys to be his sexual slaves. Hundreds of them. This is how sick and evil this person was. And remember, guys, this was before the internet. This was before Facebook, before social media. It was before video games, and people were still sick and evil. People today, they'll say things like, "Oh, back in the day, things were better because nowadays, we have the internet and it's corrupting everybody, and video games are making people more violent." Well, before video games, hundreds of years before video games, you had Vlad the Impaler, and there were no video games. Video games did not exist, and you had Mehmet II, who was not only a mass murderer, he was also a massive pedophile / pederast. He was an absolute sicko, and he sexually groomed Radu the Handsome. So Radu the Handsome became the homosexual lover to the Sultan, Mehmet II. So when Mehmet II was at war with Vlad the Impaler, he went to Vlad the Impaler's younger gay brother, Radu, and he said, I'm going to use you as a proxy to get rid of your brother. And so the Ottoman Empire, partially by a proxy war, defeated Vlad the Impaler, and then they cut his head off, and then Mehmet II kept his head as a trophy. So here you had, people say, let's go back to the old days. Let's go back to trad-based Christendom. Okay, so you want to go back to a mass murderer who butchered his fellow white man, And you want to go back to the days of a homosexual Romanian king who worked with the Ottomans to defeat his sadistic impaler of a brother. Those days were very sick and they were very evil, and so when you go to this historical event, you see, okay, Vlad the Impaler is fighting the Muslims. Oh, based, Christendom, trad, based Christendom. Okay, but he's butchering his fellow European. And then you have his younger gay brother who is in alliance with the Ottomans, and then he defeats Vlad the Impaler. So here you have Europeans joining with Ottomans, and you have Europeans killing each other. And also, during the conflict between Vlad the Impaler and the Ottomans, Vlad the Impaler actually had to fight against the Moldavans because the Ottoman Empire made an alliance with the Moldavans against Vlad the Impaler, and the Moldavans preferred to ally with the Ottomans against Vlad the Impaler because Vlad the Impaler was such a sick bastard. And then when Radu was fighting against his own brother as a proxy for the Ottomans, he actually sent out a message to all of the Romanians, to all of the Wallachians, and he said, "Oh, people of Wallachia, let's join together to overthrow this butcher." Well, who was the butcher? It was they weren't referring to Mehmet II. They weren't talking about the Ottomans. They were literally talking about some Romanian European leader named Vlad III. So, and because Vlad was such a butcher, his own people would eventually side with his younger gay brother. That's how much they hated Vlad the Impaler. So here you have Vlad the Impaler, a European, fighting against the Muslims, but then you have Europeans siding with the Muslims against Vlad. You have Vlad, who's a European, butchering his fellow European, and he is such a butcher and he's so evil that people in Wallachia chose to be under his gay younger brother who was a vassal of the Ottomans. Yes, let's go back to the olden days of Christendom when things were trad. Then you have people saying, oh, let's go back to the Crusades, right? Because the closest thing that you can find in history to a united Christendom against Islam is probably the First Crusade, right? Probably the First Crusade. Well, even in the First Crusade, the Christians were in conflict. You had the Franks in conflict with the Greeks, and even around the time of the First Crusade, the Franks were fighting with the Greeks. In fact, one of the reasons that motivated Urban II to launch the First Crusade was to get the Europeans to stop killing each other. It was to get the Western Europeans, the Franks, to stop butchering one another because they couldn't stop killing one another. So he launched the First Crusade. So people say, let's go back to the Crusader days. Oh, yes, it was so base, so trad. Oh, and by the way, later on in Crusader history, you will see Catholics butchering Eastern Orthodox Greeks in Constantinople. And by the way, Constantinople was a city that was built entirely on Christianity. Constantine built Constantinople because he wanted a capital whose roots were deep in Christianity and not in the paganism of Rome. So here you had a city whose roots were entirely Christian being raped and pillaged and ravaged by other Christians, not Muslims. The Muslims would later on take over Constantinople in 1453, but before that, the Catholics sacked Constantinople. And these Catholics were supposed to be on crusade. They were supposed to be fighting the Muslims. They were supposed to be liberating Jerusalem from Islamic rule, but here they were raping their fellow Christian. So when you look at the history of Islamic Christian wars, you will see that there was never a point when Europeans were not killing each other. There was never a point when one European country was not declaring war on another European country. They were constantly killing each other. There were so many wars that you could fill in an entire library with books on the subject. Books on the subject of all the wars between Europeans. And you can fast forward to the 20th century, to World War I, and you will see, okay, World War I, you had the Ottoman Empire, but it wasn't Christian Europe versus the Ottoman Empire. It was the Ottoman Empire and its German ally and its Austrian ally versus the British, the French, and the Americans. And the Americans never declared war on the Ottomans. They fought against the Germans. But nonetheless, in World War I, it wasn't this monolith, right? It wasn't this black and white view. It wasn't this black and white situation where you had, all of Christians versus the evil Ottomans. Even though the Ottomans were butchering Armenians and Greeks, who are white Christians, the Germans supported the genocide of the Armenians. The Germans even said, "Do not allow your Christian morals to impede you. Do not allow your Christian morals to push you into trying to impede the massacre of the Armenians." This was an order from the Germans. The Germans supported the massacre, the genocide, I should say, of the Armenians. And the Ottomans were butchering Greek Christians. But that didn't stop the Germans from allying with the Ottomans. That didn't stop the Austrians from allying with the Ottomans. So here you had in World War I, not a united Christian Europe, but you had Europeans who sided with the Muslims against other Christians. You had the Ottomans and the Germans and the Austrians in an alliance against Europeans. Why was this the case? Because that was always the case. And it always will be the case. And even if you go to World War II, you'll see the Nazis worked with who? The Muslim Bosnians. They had an Arab division. They worked with Turkish Nazis. They even had Turkish Nazi units. And they had Ukrainian Catholics joining with the Nazis. And you had Croatian Catholics joining with the Nazis to butcher who? Other Europeans? Poles? Russians? Serbs? So, just as in history, there was never a time when Europeans were completely united, so in the future, there's never going to be a time when that happens. In the future, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be Europeans allying with Muslims to kill other Europeans. It's going to be Europeans butchering other Europeans. The same thing's going to happen in the future, just like it happened in the past. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.